Okay, thanks everyone. I'd also just want to quickly do an acknowledgement. KJ, Karen Jackson and Paolo Bella was going to speak with me, but unfortunately they're not able to do that, so I'll communicate the whole talk today. So I'm really honored to be afforded the space during these very contentious times around the world to speak here to you. I acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues, their struggles, resilience and survivance. I'm thankful that they've welcomed and included me in the spaces that they continue to create, heal, recover and decolonize. It's an amazing space if you haven't been to Mundani Balak yet. Yesterday we heard some amazing talks, and one of the things that stood out for me was Wade Kelly's talk. I think the thing that stood out for me was the recipe book at the end, and he said there's no recipe to impact. But there's always process, there's consultation, there's engagement, and there's various pathways to it. And I think that was a really important statement to make. You also had up there that impact isn't commodification. So I thought those sorts of things were really important for me because it's easy to think that those are the sorts of things that we need to look for in research. Sam's talk earlier invites us to decolonize time, or to think about time as method. So there's a whole series of ways in which we can actually think about what is it that we're being asked to engage with, and how do we actually challenge some of these sorts of notions. So I'm going to introduce to you our little group. So this is sort of our joy. I think the person who wrote this, created this, was one of our students. This is a collective of people who've been working together for quite a long time now, but this is our first coming together just post-COVID, and we ended up going to a conference together. You'll see they've changed me a little bit because I've got no facial hair on it, and I always have it, but I'm on there. Liz Gabby's on there, Chennai, Matthew Klugman, and a number of people a number of our PhD students, Roshani Jayawardena, and so forth. So these are all people who've come into the space or into a set of relationships with us because of the research that they're interested in, the sorts of topics what they want to explore, and the way in which they want to find ways of producing knowledge that can transform the world, but that also speaks to and from their experiences. Yeah, what is it? How have their lives been organized in the Australian context? So I talk about this because part of this experience reflected the way in which our relationships that we have created over time. And I think time is very important here, the temporal aspect and the space that we create. We've got one of our students who's sitting in the on Zoom, Rama, because he was also one of our PhD students who ended up getting a job in Perth, and so he works there. So this is one of the collective, and there's some other people who is not in there at the moment. This is a very important sort of statement. Gunpul woman, Professor Aileen Morton Robinson, talks about Australia as a settler colony, and she talks about the possessiveness of whiteness in this context. And I think she says belonging to the nation was racialized and inextricably tied to the accumulation of capital and the social worth, authority and ownership that this conferred. The Indigenous were excluded from the condition of belonging, and still are. The white body was the norm, measure for identifying who could belong. I put this up here because I think it's extremely important to understand this context and history. The work that we do and the research we do is very conscious of history and the way in which the past is reproduced in the present. And I think you don't have to go any further than the current Uruk Justice Commission, where you'll find lots of testimony that attests to the ways in which the past reproduces itself in the present and the effects that has on Indigenous communities. One other context for the work that we do, I come through a discipline of psychology, and psychology has also been called out, like lots of disciplines, for being complicit with colonial acts. The Australian Psychological Association wrote an apology, so it's not something that we're making up. So too did the American Psychological Association. So it's a discipline that promises a lot, but has also been complicit with fairly harmful practices, and so on. But there's also ways in which psychology, like all knowledges in universities, are produced by particular groups of people who have access to systems, and some knowledges are not included, or they can be willfully excluded. So part of the work that I have been doing has been seeking alternative pathways, and there's lots of alternative pathways, not necessarily in the canons or in the archives of the disciplines that we work within or from. So I've listed some there, and some of the more profound ones that have been really useful for me come from indigenous spaces, decolonizing methodologies or African perspectives and so forth. But these are knowledges that's always there, but they're not always present. So there's two sorts of parts to the work that we do. The impact for us has to be within the discipline, because disciplines are created by us, and there's different stakeholders who have differential access to whose knowledge counts. And then we have got the social reality. So those two things have to go together. So as part of that context, so the work that I've been doing, you won't believe, I started at VU in 1993 as a student. Don't say that, Catherine. And then I studied here, and I think I was one of two people who graduated, and I think was the first person to graduate from the psychology program here. And then I left and went and worked in Perth for a very long time. And I think the move from here to Perth was, what did I call it once? I think it was like a transition into another place, but it was a transition into very different encounters with culture. And encounters with indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being. And it was profoundly unsettling for someone who had trained in a discipline that said, oh my God, we can go and do empowerment and all this sort of stuff. And I said, what does it mean to do empowerment work in a colonial space, or in a colonizing space? So it was really important for me to think through those sorts of things, because the very tools and resources that we learned from our discipline were so invested in particular sets of assumptions and absences that the risk of doing harm was more likely than the risk of doing empowerment-oriented work. So part of the journey for me also has been, how do we create, and what are the sorts of psychologies that we want to create that can contribute to the broader sorts of aspirations of world making or creating safe spaces and so forth. So this work, I think, as we go with it, I worked with a colleague in Puerto Rico, and we've come together to talk a little bit about how do we think through some of the sorts of challenges that is present in our discipline, and our complicity and the discipline and knowledge production institutions' complicity with power. So this is what we ended up with, a decolonizing standpoint that brings into clearer view ways in which power, privilege, oppression are reproduced and contested through racialized and ethnicized practices and discourses. That is, how social inequality is maintained and challenged through culture. But we also said that, part of this will be thinking about the epistemics, the who gets to know, who doesn't get to know, whose knowledge is valued, whose knowledge isn't valued, and on whose terms. How do we work toward interculturality? And interculturality is about eliminating the forms of culture in its normative function. Some people talk about this as forms of whiteness. Chipping away at institutional processes that marginalize historically oppressed ways of being, knowing, doing, and including knowledge itself. So translating some of this has always been a hard process, but there's always been methodology. So lots of people write about how do you actually do research in ways that doesn't victim blame, that doesn't reproduce inequity, that doesn't assume that we're objective and we do research from nowhere. There's always a position, and so feminist literatures, indigenous literatures, all different literatures speak about the fact that we do research from somewhere. So there's desire-based research where people say, well, instead of focus on damage, let's focus, it's not strength-based, it's desire-based. Focus on what is it that people aspire to, what is it that they want in their lives. Relationality as a sort of an ethics of care that Liz spoke about yesterday. Standing up with, standing up as, and instead of researching on. There's a sort of an ethical commitment to the sort of work that we want to do. And I think we also have storytelling as methodology. Some indigenous communities talk about this as yarning, but I think there's a whole storytelling, not just as a method, but as an epistemology, as a way of creating the world. So this is extremely important. So we try to move from what are some of those sorts of imperatives around doing research that is culturally safe and that produces conditions in which people feel safe. Yeah, and then how do we do that? So this is an ongoing project for us and for all of the students and colleagues that we work with. So with some of that context, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a couple of projects that we've been involved with. And these projects came about partly because I was asked to do a small evaluation of a project. I think with Liz, I walked up to Berkeley Street Arts when they were still there and knocked on the door and said, I've just come from Perth. In Perth, I did lots of work with communities and arts practice and so forth. So this particular project that Liz spoke about yesterday was with the young people from the African diaspora. We worked with them because they were interested in telling their stories. There's lots of stories that circulate about African people, and often all African people get Sudanized, I think people say. So there's representation of criminal, culturally incompatible, and so forth. But these young people, they mostly have grown up here. So they were interested in how do we actually shift and create alternative narratives, alternative stories. So part of our work was to also figure out how do we do research, because people are also suspicious of researchers who come and take them away, publish them. So how do we do research and how do we accompany them? So accompaniment as the process of providing support for the very deep psychological work that they do as they create, retell their stories, create alternatives, and place them in the public space as a counter-memory or doing counter work to dominant narratives that circulate. And then also, what do we do with them to document their work and to reflect with them on the work that they do that's for them, by them. So this was AMCA. And AMCA came on the back of them having had some really horrible experiences with people representing or interviewing, representing them, and then everything goes away. So this was them saying we need to be able to do work for us, by us. So part of what we ended up doing was to gather their stories. I think it's really, really important for us to understand the stories that people tell about their lives. Where are the pain points in their stories? What are the sorts of struggles, and how best do we, at the university, how best do I, as the university, as someone who's interested in community psychology, how best do we support the work that they want to do in creating spaces for themselves? So this particular project, Liz mentioned some of this yesterday. So some of the stories that they conveyed weren't only stories about being excluded, but they were also the stories of retrieving memory, retrieving history, and how people reroute those sorts of things in this country as meaningful resources for identity making and navigating their social worlds. It was also connecting with ancestral resources, the memories that their parents tell of who they can be, but also the transnational diaspora. So there's lots of things that they do proactively within communities and so forth that we don't always see. But the main thing that they also wanted to do for themselves, firstly, was to actually portray this at a major performing center. And this was the Melbourne, what is it? The Art Center, the Art Center. So one of the things that was interesting for us in this was that we create a space, an encounter space. Yeah? So it's someone's experience that gets performed and others get to be witnesses to that. So they did that and they asked us to document some of this. And it was sort of interesting, and then we said, well, how are we going to get a sense of what people say and do? So we ended up just doing small audience surveys and so forth. And it was interesting. And then one of the students that we had examined the responses of audience members. We didn't ask for how much did you like this thing. We said, what did you learn about yourself? What did you learn about your community? And what are some of the sorts of things that stood out for you? And then we also asked people to self-identify. How would you identify yourself? And people would say, I don't know, Greek Australian, some would say Caucasian, some would say white Australian, and so on. So there's a whole range of categories. And then one of the students had this project of looking at how do people who identify themselves as white Australians engage with the narratives of the young people. And it was sort of fascinating, well, and it sort of wasn't, because people talked about the psychological distance that exists between their experience and that of the people that they saw convey their stories, which is an important thing. A lot of people say that the story resonates with their parents' stories of migration. And a lot of people said that it made me feel guilty, or it made me feel bad, and I didn't want to feel bad. So I think there was so there were interesting things. So part of us is, what is the role of aesthetic witnessing in fostering empathy and so forth. So that was this project. It was very powerful. There was a lot of stuff that came out of it, including, I think, a master's dissertation and some writing that we did around the role of art or aesthetic interruption when it comes to thinking about how we engage with different communities. Yeah. So for one of the people who was in it, it was about a platform for herself and others to represent themselves. And it is very much about nothing about us without us, and so maybe just nothing about us unless we do it, I think. And being able to recenter the African narrative in a way that created a journey of reflection and critical conversations. They weren't continuing the same narrative of the African diaspora that is here in Australia, which is underrepresented on many platforms, spoken about out of context, and usually given a single narrative, as incompatible. So this is the work that they want to do. So grow in particular spaces and be supported to do that growth. They've gone on, I think, to form this collective, and Liz mentioned some of this collective yesterday. So the way that we worked with the group in this collective is we also had a PhD student accompany this group for over 3 years, Rama. And this was about how they had this desire to be supported to create a self-determined collective so that they can put on performances, shows, and so forth. VU has been great in supporting these projects, and I think we invited some people, and John Price turned up to one of the sessions when we actually launched this thing. And it was quite significant because the launch was them speaking to the university. There's a lot of imagery around place. People who are typically not in the university coming into the university space to share their story is extremely important. And for us, that represented, or one of the ways that we understood that particular moment is sort of a challenge to the epistemology of privilege that circulates in this place. Yep. It's opening up this place to other knowledges, to community knowledges, as lived, important, and valid knowledges that needs to be understood alongside the work that we create here. Sometimes this work becomes so abstracted that it gets removed from the realities of everyday life. So this project was really important for that. So this was another one that ended up being a PhD. I lost track of time now. 3 minutes. Okay, 2. Okay, so I won't talk about, so that gives me out of the Black Women's Healing. The Future Reset project that we're supporting with Vic Health is also important, and Matthew Klugman and Sam Keast and some other people are on this particular project. Here we're also trying to reimagine how best do we support people and groups realize their aspirations, and how best do we document the work that they produce, and how best do we make comments about the work that they produce and the comments that they make about the world that they live in and the worlds that they want to live in. So this is Rosie Kalina, Paula's daughter, who's one of the people in that project. And they all talk about the importance of having safe spaces. They all talk about the importance of having spaces where they are not the LGBTQI representative, the young person, the person of color, but they come as full people into the spaces. So what does that look like? So that's the idea of cultural safety. And so how do you create research spaces, or how do you create spaces where these young people themselves become the drivers of research? So Narelle said 1 minute, so I'm not going to talk about this one. This is the Black Women's Healing Project, and I think the images speak for themselves. But I want to just say, I've rushed a little bit. So I want to say that part of the work for us is to think about and to rethink the idea of not university community, but community-university engagement, a model of and a way of thinking about what are the responsibilities of, maybe it is VU's ethical researcher, real-world researcher, but a role for us, the group that I work with, that brings our work closer to scholar activism, where the university embraces the epistemic plurality. It becomes open to other people, open to Mundani Balak, open to indigenous knowledges. We're interested in knowledges and strategies from below, from indigenous struggles, from community memory, from the diaspora, as the focus and the basis for radical imagination and building solidarities. For me, I think that's part of what the ethical researcher or the real-world researcher invokes when we think about how do we think about impact and the multiple ways in which that can manifest. I had to race.
Amazing.
Amazing.
Thanks so much.